Before we start, we're honored to have the Dean of Arts here with us, Professor Douglas Peers, who will offer us a few words of warm welcome.
Thank you, Jim. I must say, when walking around outside today, I figured the weather is here for my benefit. I am from the prairies, so this is kind of bringing me back home. And as far as the parking goes, there's nothing that unites a campus more than parking. So if you want a real ecumenical approach to life, choose parking. Everybody can agree and complain about it. Anyways, I'm very delighted to be here. I'm here both to express my gratitude to Jim and the others for mounting this talk this evening, both from the perspective of the Faculty of Arts, where religious studies and Jewish studies are an integral part of the kind of academic training we believe in the Faculty of Arts, but also to express my warm welcome and thanks on behalf of President Feridun Hamdalapur, who unfortunately could not be here this evening, but again, would like to thank Dr. Higgins for his presentation tonight. So you're not here to listen to me talk about the good old days of the prairies, so I'll turn it over to Michael Higgins.
Not yet, Michael Higgins, you got to listen to me. So, by the way, my name is Jim Diamond. I'm the Joseph and Wolf Lubavitch Chair of Jewish Studies here, and again, welcome to everybody here. It's really a tribute to the community to see. I honestly didn't expect this many people here tonight, so it's a tribute to the community that comes out to listen to a serious issue and serious matters. Tonight we really have we're really honored to have Professor Michael Higgins with us. Many of you here know him already. For those of you who don't, he's a Vatican Affairs specialist for the Globe and Mail and CTV network, Catholic educator, CBC radio documentarian, a scholar and an administrator. He was formerly the vice chancellor and president of St. Jerome's University. He's currently a professor of religious studies and vice president for mission and Catholic identity at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. He's edited and co-edited, authored and co-authored 16 books. And some of them actually have achieved what most academics could only dream of, becoming national bestsellers. When I last looked at my most recent statement for my first book for 2015, they sold 3 copies and 2 were returned. So, so we have an exceptional scholar here tonight. I know who they were, too, who returned them. They took them home and photocopied them and gave them back. In any event, just a few words on the topic. This is the third, really, in a series of lectures that Michael has offered before, both on the previous 2 popes, on Pope Benedict and on Pope John Paul. So it's a kind of a trilogy, each one addressing the various popes and their relationship with the Jews and the Jewish community. And this particular pope, Pope Francis, about a year ago, I picked up a fascinating book that he co-authored when he was, prior to becoming a pope, when he was still a cardinal in Argentina. He formed a very, very close relationship with a prominent rabbi in Argentina, Rabbi Skorka, and they actually co-authored a book together. And I strongly recommend it for everybody here. And it's a book that they both entered into a dialogue on lots of important issues, on God, on the future of religion, on interreligious dialogue, evil, and certain topics that were particular to the Jewish experience, like the Holocaust and the Middle East conflict. But I found it quite remarkable. That is, the venture itself, this is prior to him becoming a pope, of entering into a real honest dialogue and clearly forming an intimate and a friendship between these 2 prominent representatives of respective religious communities. But what was really remarkable was that each met each other, encountered each other coming from their own positions. That is, they didn't paper over differences. The kind of politically correct claptrap that you hear about that we're all the same and we all believe in the same thing and we all believe in the same God, it's clearly not true. And I think actually more serious than not being true, actually quite dangerous. That is, true dialogue is one that takes place between people that have differences, but encounter each other in the common ground of their humanity and of their shared humanity. And this is what this book really strikingly reflects. It's called On Heaven and Earth, and as I said, it was co-authored by the rabbi and the present pope. And in the preface, the present pope says that I encountered and dialogued with the rabbi on these grounds, and we remained friends and walked the same path towards God, but remaining firm in our positions. So it's in that tradition that I want to call on Michael, who was, I think, one of the best things that happened to me when I entered into the academy, that I came to an institution that had a Michael Higgins. Unfortunately, he left a number of years after I came, but we've remained friends, and I strategically formed that friendship because I thought you had a chance of becoming the Pope, but that wasn't to be. So here we are. Here's Michael Higgins, and I'm sure, as I said, this will warm up your night.
Thank you, Jim, for leaving me a little time for the lecture now. I want you to know that I'm the guy who bought the book that didn't return it. I'm working on the film rights. And I got to tell you, it's not going anywhere. Okay, part 3, Jim is correct. I've spoken earlier about 2 previous popes, Kerr Wojtyła, John Paul II, and Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, and their relationship to the Jewish community. Tonight I'm going to be looking very specifically at at Francis Jorge Mario Bergoglio. And I'm going to go at it in a kind of strategic way, if you like, and we'll go over parts of it. And I'm going to introduce you more closely, I think more intimately, with the man that Jim alluded to, and that's Rabbi Abraham Skorka, who has become actually a personal friend. So, and it has provided me with access to an insight into Bergoglio I would never have had otherwise. I have no entree to the current Pope. I haven't been to Rome since he became Pope. I have no special reason to see him, but because of Skorka, I think I understand him to a degree that that many Vaticanisti do not. And it is entirely predicated on that very special relationship that Skorka has with him and that he treasures. So let me go through this with you tonight, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions or comments afterwards. First of all, the context. What is it like to be a Jew now in Europe? It's not very good. And we have to keep this as the backdrop to Francis's mounting anxiety over the emergence of an ever more belligerent anti-Semitism in Catholic countries in Europe, the Catholic countries that are deeply secularized, of course, like France and Belgium, but countries of Catholic origin and genesis. Very importantly, there's a marvelous passage by Cardinal André Vintroy that was quoted shortly after the kosher market massacre in January of this year. The Cardinal is the Archbishop of Paris. Here's what he says. Even a caricature in bad taste or a gravely unjust criticism cannot be put on the same level as murder. This is his message to the capital Catholics. Press freedom, whatever its price, is the sign of a mature society. The great majority of our fellow citizens here in France experienced the situation as a call to rediscover some fundamental values of our own republic, such as freedom of religion or of opinion. That French Jews have paid once more for the troubles that agitate our nation makes them doubly grave. Now, it's very important to hear Cardinal Vintra say this, not least because since the death of Cardinal Lustiger, the advocacy for deepened Catholic-Jewish dialogue in France has been in some part eclipsed by many of the debates over laïcité and concerns over the presence of Islam in France, particularly radical Islam, largely identified with part of the Algerian colonial experience. So for any number of different reasons, to have the senior prelate, he's not the primate is the Cardinal Archbishop of Lyon, but the most important prelate in France, come out and say what he did with alacrity is an indication, I think, again, of the message that Francis has sent, both in relation to any kind of persecution, Christians, Muslims, but most specifically Jews, that we must respond quickly and without hesitation. There is a lovely passage that I want to quote as well, around the same time by a different man who's retired and is now the Master of Magdalen College at Cambridge, and that is Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who has become a friend of Francis, though in truth is really actually a close personal friend of Francis's predecessor. Here's what he says. For sane religious believers, God does not need defending. People of faith may be hurt and offended by mockery of their convictions, especially if they already feel threatened or powerless. Think of the nasty history of anti-Semitic humor through so much of the 20th century, even after the 1930s, not to mention the resurgent anti-Semitism of our own day and the intensified fears that last week's events have aroused in the Jewish communities throughout all of Europe, and not only in France or in Belgium. And here I think is the Archbishop's wonderful peroration or final line. But we need to be clear that the problem is ours. It's not God's. The problem is ours. It is not God's. Earlier, Jim had alluded to the friendship between Bergoglio and Scorca, and I'm going to later on talk about this in the context of anti-Semitic behavior in Buenos Aires, which is the home for both of these men. And what happens in terms of Christian-Jewish solidarity when you exist under the shadow of persecution. Well, all this gives a kind of lightning strength or cogency to the discussion tonight because it's never far from our horizon. The media regularly provides us with ample opportunity to reflect on the perduring legacy of anti-Semitic behavior, but also on the necessity for Catholic leadership in order to stanch it, to exercise it, to directly confront it. Confronting is a very important thing to understand about the style of Pope Francis. This is a very different pope from the two previous popes, and his relationship to the Jews is going to be to some degree emblematic or illustrative of his pastoral relationship with his own community and with the larger faith communities in the world. It is not insignificant to note, for instance, that when Karol Wojtyła was elected Pope in 1978, he chose very shortly after that to go to Poland. And when he went to Poland, he went for regime change, not his regime. He initiated regime change, and the Poles were very conscious of that. Right? When Benedict was elected Pope in 2005, although it wasn't his first country, within a very short period of time, it was the second, he was in Cologne, and then latterly in Regensburg and in Munich and whatever. Popes who are not Italian go home. It's what you do. Francis went to Israel. Israel was the first country Francis, on his own agenda, chose to travel to. He was obligated because of Benedict's commitment to go to Brazil for World Youth Day, where he managed to bring out 3+ million people on the shores of Copacabana. Right? Not a small feat by any stretch. He was only to top that with something like 7.2 million in the Philippines recently. People are enormously interested in Francis for all kinds of different reasons. But he chose to go to Israel. It was his decision. He's not gone to Argentina, by the way. And he has no intention of going because he doesn't like the Kirchners. Nestor and Cristina. Nestor that was the president throughout the 90s, and Benedict Francis used to regularly hold what is called a Te Deum. And this would be an annual celebration around the time of the founding of the Republic. And he would use this occasion to excoriate the members of the judiciary and the government for not doing their job, diminishing the economic constraints, the austerity, the troubles and whatnot. And he would, quite openly. So eventually the president of the Republic thought, oh, this is ridiculous. Why would I pay to go and be insulted like this? And stopped going. And his relationship with Cristina Kirchner, who is the current president, as you know, under investigation for possible involvement in the assassination of the prosecutor who was specifically appointed to investigate the massacre of the Jewish community in the 1990s, which was the cementing moment between Bergoglio and Skorka. Okay, so all these things are of a piece, right? And you will recall that it is Francis who does what no one else has ever done. I mean, popes go to the Wailing Wall, and they kiss the Wailing Wall. But popes don't invite the president of Israel and his equivalent in the Palestine Authority to come to Rome, which he did. And he took them into the gardens, the Vatican gardens. Not a dais, not at the Quirinale, not in the Apostolic Palace, but he took them into his garden and he prayed and he tried to find ways of saying, okay, now how do we move through people and through people of goodwill to achieve what seems to elude everyone, including the President of the United States. This is Francis. Okay? This is Francis. People love to say, well, you know, he's not a political pope like John Paul II. Oh, yes, he is. He's a very political pope. Okay? And guess what? Popes are always political. At least the ones who survive are. They know how to work. I mean, the Vatican is a city-state. It's a government. So how do you find ways to negotiate, bring the gospel to the community, build, serve as an agent of reform, and where do you go? Who do you identify as priorities? Francis identifies his relationship with the Jewish community as a priority. And I'll give you some instances of that tonight, passages from his writings, which will substantiate this. The Pope was appalled by the 80-some murders that occurred in the bombings in 1994 in Buenos Aires. And as perhaps you know, there have been rumors for a great number of years. Certainly Skorka believes it, and he allowed me to think that Bergoglio believes it, and I suspect he's right, that there is a very direct Iranian connection to it. But the point is now, as you know, with the death of Prosecutor Nisman, with the possible implication of the president of Argentina, the likelihood of this exploding is considerable. And it cannot but be a point of pained memory for Francis. At the same time, it cannot help but be a source of some hope for him, because he's been concerned ever since that event that the issue has not achieved closure. This is important to understand because there are debates about Francis's involvement in the dirty war in Argentina. What did Francis do? Where was he? Did he support the Jesuits in their commitment to liberation theology? Was he more concerned with what he began to define as a kind of hybrid of a theology of the people linked up with a form of Peronism? He rejected Peronism, following the traditions of the Perons, but at the same time working out a theology which was kind of middle in between that of the liberationists and that of the traditional Peronists. And so he developed his own theology. As a consequence, there were great divisions within the Jesuit community during his time in Argentina, And there is, it's a bit beside the point, but if you're interested in these kinds of things, you might want to follow up on this. There is a great debate right now between two papal biographers over the supposed Argentine conversion. And they're both British. One is Paul Vallely, who works for the Independent of London, worked for the Times for a while, and is associated with the Tablet, which is a Catholic British newspaper. And the other one is Austin Ivory, whose most recent book has come out, and they disagree entirely on the Argentina experience. One of them says, well, he never really converted, and the other one says he did. And what does this in fact mean? Well, let the biographers fight it out. What they all do conclude as demonstrably true is that Francis's involvement in Argentine ecclesial and political life was never easy. Never easy. When you speak your mind as he does, and as we've seen countless instances of it, whether it's a scrum on a plane, whether he gets off out of the Pope-mobile when he goes and he talks to people, or he departs from his speeches at a press conference. He does all these things. He does not stay with the script. This is the Pope who doesn't like to be scripted. And I think, as we all know, when that happens, the potential for controversy is considerable. Right? But it also means the potential for free, open thinking, speaking, vulnerability, and just the sheer pleasure of listening to a pope to see what's going to come out of that mouth, rather than august platitudes, is itself a source of great interest. On the issue of the Jews, Francis, however, doesn't indulge in unpredictabilities. He's consistent and he's firm. Underscoring the close ties between Christianity and Judaism early into his pontificate, he said that Holocaust denial is madness. He told one of his interviewers that inside every Christian is a Jew. He's absolutely committed to this. Right? That Judaism is at the heart or the core of not only Christianity's gestation, but important to its very definition. In a wide-ranging interview that he conducted about a year into his pontificate with a Spanish newspaper, La Vanguardia, the Pope said dialogue between the two faiths can sometimes be a hot potato. Now, that's not classic papal parlance, but it is classic Francis colloquialisms. Okay. He said, I believe that interreligious dialogue must investigate the Jewish roots of Christianity and the Christian flowering of Judaism. I understand it as a challenge, a hot potato, but it is possible to live as brothers and sisters. End of quote. Francis's statement actually goes further than that of his predecessor, now sainted John Paul II, who made headlines himself in 1986 as the first pope to visit Rome's main synagogue and declared Jews to be the elder brothers of the Christian faith. Here's what Francis said shortly after the interview. Every day, I pray with the Psalms of David. My prayer is Jewish. Then I have the Eucharist, which is Christian. Now just think of the order of that. And to think of the freedom that comes in being able to say that. Other popes would not have said it, or they would have nuanced it, or they would have contextualized it, or they would have framed it in an entirely different way in the context of debates around supersessionism or different dispensations or whatever. Francis doesn't do that. Just Francis says it right out. It's unalloyed, it's clear, you take it for what it is. What then is the Jewish response to Francis himself? It is interesting to see the chief rabbi in Rome, Riccardo di Segni, who has been critical of various of the Roman pontiffs, has been quite taken by Francis. Earlier on, he commented, this pontiff does not cease to surprise. His words are not new, but rather inherent in Christianity, as confirmed by Vatican II. It is the force with which he expresses them and his capacity of communicating them. That is the astounding part. Another Jewish scholar observed and quite rightly, that Pope Francis is unassuming, unscripted, warm. He's a leader in the International Interreligious Jewish Conference, and he said, the Pope provides a religious experience just simply being in his presence. End of quote. Now, that's not just pious sentiment. If you talk to even the most hardened diplomats, journalists, and nobody gets more cynical than journalists covering the beat, believe me, there is a sense that in his presence there is something uplifting. It's not hype. It's not his quasi-celebrity status. It's not the holiness and the holy trappings of his office. In fact, as I said, journalists and writers tend to be fairly skeptical about this. It's rather the absolute stark authenticity with which he's present to people, with which he is present to people. Let me repeat that. He is present to people in a profoundly phenomenological way. He listens to them. He looks at them. Let me give an example. In January, I was in Ireland. We have Sacred Heart University has a campus in Luxembourg for an executive MBA, and we have a campus in Dingle in County Kerry, in the south of Ireland. And we do some work in the whole area of Celtic spirituality and oceanography. And I don't know how those two work together, but anyway, that's what we do. We look at dolphins and we study the ancient Celtic saints. But anyway, while I was there was this wonderful Monsignor, wonderful man, Predecessor, who has translated the scriptures from Latin and from Greek into Irish. So he's one of the great figures in contemporary Ireland. He's a man of advanced years, but he's wonderful. Well, he's not always wonderful. He's quite cantankerous, actually. But when he's not cantankerous, he's really wonderful. So we were signing a formal agreement between Sacred Heart and 4 higher education institutions in Ireland, in Limerick and Cork and in Dublin. It was a big affair. And they didn't know what to do with the Monsignor because he could be quite unpredictable. So they said, well, we'll sit him with Higgins. So I got him. And I thought, we don't actually get along either, but I thought, oh, great. But anyway, I went with it. The Irish are wonderful with penitentials. So I thought, okay, I'll handle this for a while. And he was wonderful. Because he wanted to talk about the Pope. And I said, well, why? He said, well, I just came from Rome. And he's had experience with Roman authorities that have made him rather sour. I mean, he's not enamored of all the papolatry and trappings of the Roman office. He's a seasoned old guy who's been through a lot, so going to Rome just doesn't do it for him. But it was a major anniversary for him, and friends of the family took him, and he's in a wheelchair now. And when he went into the hall of Paul VI, which is the major hall, my friend Doug Letson's here tonight, and Doug and I would spend many hours in Pope Paul VI. It's that kind of intimate hall for 10,000. And this crowd is all there, and he's up at the front. And after the Pope gives his little locution or whatever, he comes down to all the people who are handicapped, particularly those who are sitting in the wheelchairs. And he talks to each one of them. And you don't get the sense this is a photo op. This isn't John Paul II was very much a man of the theater, very much a man of the moment, very much a man of the gesture. Francis is different. So Francis goes, and all the cameras aren't there. He's just Francis. And he spends time going to each one. When he came to Monsignor Finata, he got on his knees and he massaged his ankles because they were swollen. And he talked to him a little bit in Irish because Bergoglio learned his English in Ireland. That's one of the reasons now nobody can understand his English. So it's absolutely unintelligible. But he spoke a little Irish to him while he was massaging his ankles. And didn't rush. And then he got up and he went to the next person. So I said to him, oh, what did you think of that? And he said, that's the real stuff. That's the gospel. I finally tasted the gospel. Now, you can't manufacture this. Francis isn't in the background working with his several secretaries trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to handle the first row? Make sure we get the cameras right there. This is not the way he works. Just talk to the Swiss Guard, who can't protect him. Security is crazy in Italy because the Pope just doesn't obey any of the rules, right? So if he wants to kneel and spend time and talk to all these people and wash the feet of Muslim women in prison on Holy Thursday, violating all the rubrics of Catholic liturgy, he's the Pope. Okay? And that's what he's going to do. And everybody got, not everybody, but several got up, did the same thing the next year. He didn't back off. So I'm looking very forward to seeing what he does this year, because he's capable of the grand gesture, because he's capable of surprises, because he believes that the message of Jesus Christ is a message of surprises. But to understand the message of Jesus Christ is to understand our special relationship with the Jewish community. That's why he keeps going back to it. David Rosen, a prominent American rabbi, commented at one point of Francis, he has a remarkable capacity to communicate his profound humanity in simple and sincere gestures. He says, in regard to all things that he does with the Jewish community, he has elicited nothing but deep warmth on our part. And that's certainly been my experience, that the Jewish community has responded to him with tremendous warmth. And there are all kinds of reasons why. And the basic reason, in a sense, goes back to the formation of this friendship with Abraham Skorka. Skorka and Bergoglio actually began life as scientists. Skorka is a physicist. The Pope graduated with a degree in chemistry. He actually taught chemistry. And although both went on to do other things, Skorka became a Talmudic scholar, is now actually director of the major rabbinical seminary not just in Buenos Aires, but in the southern part of South America. Bergoglio went off to Germany, where he did a doctorate in theology. Both men rose into positions of leadership within their respective communities. The Jewish community in Argentina is the largest Jewish community in South America, a prominent one, right? And so the disproportionate impact of the deaths in the 1994 massacre has to be put within that context. And they cement a friendship that comes from their common humanity, The book that Jim referred to is a wonderfully refreshing book to read. It's not laced with abstruse language. There's nothing in the nature of technical jargon. What it is two thinking, curious, religious figures trying to make sense of their world. Talking about God, creation, talking about sex, talking about politics, talking about Catholic-Jewish relations, talking about, a whole range of things. Talking as two men who are religious leaders, but who are first friends. Okay? That friendship is very important. And you can actually look at it in a Buberian way. You can look at it in terms of this being a special I-thou relationship. Because the dialogue here, grounded between these two men, grounded in familiarity and love, finds itself expressed not only in their writing and their shared inquiring, but in their deep respect for each other. When Skorka and his wife Sylvia go to Rome, relatively regularly, by the way, more often than most of the Argentine prelates, when they go, Skorka makes sure that there's kosher food for them in the Santa Marta, Domus Santa Marta, where he lives. The Pope lives in a residence, actually, that was built by the Knights of Columbus, actually to house bishops who were in Rome for what are called their quinquennial or ad limino visits with the various dicasterio heads, and for cardinals to gather when they're in conclave or when they're gathering for a consistory. Francis decides he's going to live there. So he doesn't live in the Apostolic Palace. He actually lives in this kind of condominium. He has 2 rooms. And the only reason I found this out is the Pope's bedroom. But I asked Skorka, I said, so what's it like? There's 2 rooms, one kind of messy room with his bed, and then his office. That's it. Okay, that's it. This is not the way a prince lives, right? The popes traditionally live in the apostolic palace. So he looks carefully for his friend to make sure that the food is kosher food. He's solicitous about them when they come. He sits with them while they eat in the cafeteria, not hived off someplace. He makes sure that Skorka is the intermediary that allows the invitation to come from the State of Israel. And it is Skorka, along with an imam from Buenos Aires, that they have both befriended, that accompany them in Rome on the occasion of Mahmoud Abbas and President Perez meeting in the Pope's garden. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that the way the Pope works is to work through people. That's one of the reasons why I emphasized the phenomenological approach earlier on. He doesn't think in largely diplomatic terms, though he can be political. He thinks in terms of how people interact with each other. How you come to know someone is a primary reason for why you will not come to hate them. We hate in the abstract. We love in the concrete. And so what Francis does is find every occasion to provide opportunity for people to come and to hold. As you see, he's a very kind of tactile guy. He's always grabbing people, right? He's hugging them, he's holding them, he's touching them. In that way, he's affirming their existence. This is his way of saying that you're valued and you're loved. It's not just something that he says you expect the Pope to do. It's something that he does because, and unlike several of his predecessors, not all, but several, he doesn't think of himself as Pope. He thinks himself as the Bishop of Rome, one pastor among others. Now, of course, he is different by the very fact that he's Bishop of Rome. But it's like being the bishop on the River Plate. He translated all of that to being the bishop on the Tiber. And he has no truck with all the frippery and the millinery and the traditions and the scheming and all the wonderful things that make up centuries of incrustation in the life and plannings and intrigues that characterize Vatican life. There's no truck for this, no time for it. Right? And that's why there is a profound reformation going on within the Catholic Church. There is a profound reformation. I don't know historically of anything comparable in recent centuries. And it's being led by example. It's not flawless. It's not perfect. Okay? There are all kinds of misjudgments. Sometimes you want to say, well, maybe you should have done it this way. But what you see, though, is a remarkable freeness of the spirit. That freeness of spirit is what Skorka sees in him. And when you talk to Skorka, he comes back again and again. I said to him one time, will he be defeated by his enemies in the Curia, by his enemies in Rome, the number of which, if not legion, is significant? And he said no, because he doesn't care. You see, you can only be defeated if actually you take them seriously. He says, and he looked at me and he said, Michael, they don't know my Jorge. They don't know my Jorge. He will walk right through them. Okay? He's grounded in the exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. He knows what he's going to do, and he doesn't care where the chips fall. All right? One of the reasons that drives security crazy. He doesn't care. All right? No Pope. And Skorka has talked about this, and other Jewish leaders in Italy, Sidney talked about it. No Pope has taken on the mafia the way Francis has. No Pope. Not only does he denounce the Ndrangheta, the Camorra, all of the groups, the Cosa Nostra, all the groups that constitute the mafia, because they're regional, of course, the Ndrangheta being the worst, the most brutal. He's fearless. He denounces them. He excommunicates them. No one's done this before. And then the coup de grace. He shows up at the small church where every year the survivors of victims of the mafia come to remember their dead. the Pope shows up. Now, what message does this send to the mafia? Sir Ivor Roberts, who is he's currently president of Trinity College at the University of Oxford, and was for many years an ambassador to Yugoslavia, when there was a Yugoslavia, to Italy, and to a couple of other countries. He has written, and he's a man of great sobriety, as traditional British ambassadors tend to be, not inclined to extravagant sentiment or whatever. And he's a Catholic, and he says he fears that the Pope will be assassinated by the mafia, because no one has taken them on this way. And of course, the reforms that he initiated by establishing both the Secretariat of the Economy, the Secretariat of the Economy, and the Council of the Economy, so he's got these two major reforming bodies that didn't even exist before, which are in the process of bringing an end to money laundering in the Vatican. He's been responsible for jailing at least one Monsignor. I was called Monsignor 500 because the smallest euro note he carried was 500. Monsignor Nunzio is now in an Italian jail. And Francis will purge this. He will reform. And he doesn't care for his personal welfare. Okay? It's difficult to frighten someone when they don't care. He'll often say, I'm an old man. Although it's interesting, he always refers to Benedict as the old man. He says, I'm having a conversation with the old man. I think there's something like 6 years between them. Benedict's about 85 or 86, and Francis has just turned 79. But there's not a huge gap here. But it's kind of a playful thing. It's a reverent thing. Okay, so it's a reverent thing. So the book on heaven and earth between Skorka and Bergoglio is a very valuable tool to have, because it gives us an insight into their own mind, their own respective minds, and the electric engagement that occurs between the two of them. Bergoglio's concern for his elder brothers in the faith, the Jews, continues right through his pontificate. He calls the Jews the elder brothers when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and he continues to do so now. 2 days after his election, Francis sent a personal invitation to attend his installation to Dr. Riccardo Di Segni, as I said before, Rome's chief rabbi. He also ordered that no public funeral would be countenanced for Erich Priebke, Luberstemmbannführer, and a Nazi war criminal who had been on the lam for 50 years in Argentina and was to be buried in Italy. To thwart the Pope's directive, the Society of St. Pius X planned to give the mass murderer a funeral in Italy itself. An outraged crowd blocked the crowd, and this is not the first time that Francis has had his run-in with Marcel Lefebvre's brood, the Society of Pius X. In November of last year, the Lefebvres disrupted the Kristallnacht service in the cathedral in Buenos Aires. Francis asked the Polish hierarchy to go to the aid of the Jewish community there by lobbying against a law that will prohibit the kosher slaughter of meat. He's also been approached by a German rabbi to intervene specifically on another issue of a convent near Auschwitz. You may remember that there was a convent actually on the ground, Auschwitz ground, by the Carmelites, and eventually John Paul II asked the sisters to move. It took many years and many interventions. He had a group of Italian cardinals and a Polish cardinal, Cardinal Macharski was one of them, and eventually the Pope directly intervened. And there is a similar thing that's occurred here, and Francis is simply not going to wait that long. He's simply not going to wait that long. And so you see, once again, his remarkable ability to move with alacrity when he senses or when he sees any kind of injustice. In the conversation that occurred between Peres and Mahmoud Abbas, that whole atmosphere in which it occurred, just to kind of remember the way I set the scene, Francis made the decision that he would not act like a head of state. It was the church happening. In this case, it was creating an interreligious dialogue as a covert method not to convert a Jew and a Muslim to Christianity in an unguarded moment. That's not what it was. Some thought that that might be a certain Vatican stratagem to bring them both over to the Roman bosom, but that wasn't going to happen. No, interreligious dialogue goes to the very heart of the Church's mission to serve the world as a kind of, and some of you may remember this phrase that Francis famously observed on more than one occasion, that the Church is a field hospital. It's where the broken and the wounded need healing. So the primary charism, the primary thrust of the pontificate is defined by mercy, by the expression of mercy, by the living of mercy, by moving beyond judgment to forgiveness and to understanding. Now, this all sounds rather wonderful and perhaps a little platitudinous, and popes love to pontificate. After all, what's a pope for, if not to pontificate? But then comes the tough part. How actually do you live that? How do you find ways of showing that mercy? Well, the instance of his kneeling, massaging the swollen ankles of a very old priest who meant nothing to him, was an example of what he understood to be Christ's present to the broken and the suffering. And that's how he interprets his primacy. That's how he interprets his role as the Bishop of Rome. The relationship between Skorka and, I keep going back to this because this is so foundational, between Skorka and the Pope is defined in no small part upon their shared authenticity. The many conversations that Skorka regales me with concerning the fiery and animated exchange of opinion between the two of them, even if colored by exaggeration occasionally or an inclination to make them more apocryphal than factual, the fact remains that the majority of them have about them the air of truth. I'm sure they all do, because they speak immediately and pointedly to the fact that dialogue for them is not just simply a polite exchange of opinion. It is not simply a soft ecumenism, a cheap irenicism, as Benedict would call it. It is rather a profound encounter. In fact, there's a very important word in this, I'll get to it in a minute, between the two subjects themselves. Not the content, but the subjects. Right? It's less important what is being said, and it is more important in that you love the one who is saying it. You listen to them, and you have not so much a dialogue in a way as you have a genuine encounter. It's the encountering of the other. It's the breaking down of the division of the strangers. For Francis, this goes back a great deal to his own Ignatian spirituality, as well as to the natural hospitality that is characteristic of the Latin temperament. Both built together allow him in an important way to find in dialogue with people of different faiths common ground. Common ground not just because it's strategic, but common ground because it is immersed in a fundamental anthropology, philosophical anthropology, that is deeply respectful of each other. Sounds great. How do you achieve it? You achieve it through friendship, and you achieve it over a very long time of coming to love your friend. Your friend that can be irritating, can be provocative, can be wrong-headed, can disagree with you. It's easy to love your friends when they're your allies, and they're there to pat you on the back, and they're there to applaud everything that you say, and they're there to celebrate your achievements. Right? Different when the friend comes to tell you what you don't want to hear, or what you dread to have disclosed. That friendship and the capacity to allow that friendship to flourish with those conditions means that you've moved to a new level of mutual understanding and love. And that's really at the heart of Francis's relationship to the rabbi. I think this will go down as one of the great spiritual relationships of the century. I'm serious about that. I mean, we have all kinds of instances of people who befriend each other. I alluded earlier, Rowan Williams is a good friend of Pope Benedict. They find a point of connection which is not just theological or structural or driven by office, but is a co-sympathy. It's a co-sympathy. It's an entering into the other's mind and imagination. The friendship between these two men is going to go a long way to solidify a new era of Catholic-Jewish relations, because it's not primarily based upon specific theological or biblical arguments, as it is upon a rootedness in the fundamental realization that there is a Jew in every Christian, and that Judaism is an important dimension, perhaps even one of the most important dimensions, in the evolution of Catholic faith. This can be very startling for traditional Christian ears to hear, and can be, in fact, in some cases, disturbing. This Jewish Catholic understanding that Skorka and Bergoglio talk about is highlighted in some of the passages. I'm just going to read a couple of them here because I think they're so powerful, in a section on the Holocaust, in which they're talking, and Skorka says, talking about the great Russian, French, Jewish painter Marc Chagall, he says, one of Marc Chagall's pieces shows Jesus being crucified while wearing a talis. There is also a menorah burning at his feet, and scenes of violence all around him. Synagogues set ablaze, elderly Jews fleeing the scene, trying to save the sacred scrolls of the Torah. Frightened women and children running away. I have always said that in the death camps, they do not just kill 6 million Jews, but they killed Jesus 6 million times over. That is because many of Jesus' ideas and his message were Jewish, since he carried the message of the prophets. This is the rabbi speaking. Bergoglio responds, this is a very Christian belief. Jesus is in every suffering person. We complete in our suffering what is lacking in Christ's passion. Skorka responds, not by repeating that, but by saying something startling. Yes, it is also found in Talmudic thought. See how they, in the conversation itself, how they took something, arresting in and of itself, set aside perhaps, more conventional, brought into a certain kind of creative convergence or synergy that could only have happened when you have two friends deeply comfortable in the presence of the other. So comfortable they can say what their heart feels. There's another lovely passage in this when, here's Bergoglio talking. He says, what you said about opening the archives relating to the Shoah seems perfect to me. They should open them and clarify everything. Then it can be seen if they could have done something, to what extent it could have been done. And if we were wrong in something, we will be able to say, we were wrong in this. We do not have to be afraid of that. We have to know that we were wrong. The objective has to be the truth. When one starts to hide the truth, one eliminates the Bible. When one starts to hide the truth, one eliminates the Bible. Strange phrasing. One believes in God, but only to a point. One is not being fair. We must not forget we are sinners and unable to stop sinning, even though it is also true that God does not want it like that. God loves us with his mercy. But if I do not recognize that I am a sinner, God's mercy does not get to me. It does not reach me. We must know the truth and go to those archives. This is extraordinary. You know what the archives are? They're the archives kept by the Holy See during the Second World War. Okay? That's what he's saying. He's saying, well, no, rather than engage in yet another what we call the Pious Wars, and it's not P-I-O-U-S, it's P-I-U-S, the Pious Wars, the debates about Pius XI and the encyclical and fascism, and very importantly, the debates around Eugenio Pacelli, who was Pius XII, and the alleged silence of the pontiff during the Holocaust or the Shoah. All of these things, debates that go on. And Francis is saying, okay, and it's very interesting because both of these, in the case of Pius XI, but also in the case of, most especially in the case of Pius XII, their causes for their beatification or sainthood are moving. And he doesn't say, okay, I think I need to protect this, or this is a specifically Catholic locus, or this is a matter that's internal and really among friends we should be able to do what we feel we need to do, and although it may be painful to you, you need to understand. He doesn't say that. He says, I think in the interest of the truth, it is important to wait until the archives are opened. Nobody had said that before. In fact, efforts to get the archives opened had been frustrated. Right? And the argument being, in part true, that the Vatican is an incredible repository of materials. But you would be wrong to think that there is a platoon of people that are dealing with this on a daily basis, keeping it up to date. The archives are always several decades behind, in part because they are under-resourced, but also because they don't give it the highest priority. What Francis is saying is, we can't really move and achieve resolution around these debates, fractious and perhaps even toxic, that have divided us until we can speak the truth, we can know the truth. And that will, in no small part, depend upon the archives. The archives right now are, to my knowledge, are released up to the beginning of the Second World War, up until 1939. So they're working on the next tranche, which will bring it up to the end of the Second World War, which should go a long way, and perhaps a painful way, to achieving that level of truth that both of them talk about. Skorka's love for Francis appears on several occasions. We invited him to Sacred Heart University to receive an honorary doctorate. And he came, and he received the honorary doctorate, and he preached in our chapel. We have a large chapel of the Holy Spirit. And everybody was so impressed by him, we invited him back to preside over a Christonaut commemoration, but also to spend some time with some of our senior faculty on a one-on-one dialogue. And so he came back again and brings his wife Sylvia with him. And each time he comes, and he kind of sees Sacred Heart in a way as his home outside of Argentina, he talks about his relationship with Francis, which just leaves me bowled over by the richness of this. Because it's a friendship that's not defined by the exchange of greetings on birthdays or holy days. It actually involves phone calls, requests. We're having a meeting on cultural issues. Can you fly over right now? We know that Pope Francis is very fond of actually getting on the phone. He just gets on the phone, phones people. A young woman in Rome who's desperate to receive communion, and her parish priest won't allow her to receive communion. She writes to the Pope phones her. A young man in Granada, in the Diocese of Granada in Spain, who has been abused by a group of about 10 priests. Nobody takes it seriously. The bishop doesn't act on it. He writes Francis. Francis phones him and orders the bishop to initiate an investigation and to hand it over to the civil authorities. The young man, the abused man, who is himself a committed Catholic, was overwhelmed by the fact that actually somebody in authority did something and that it was Francis himself. Francis phoned him. So it's not unusual for Francis to phone Skorka. Sylvia's wife says to me, the phone rang, and he picks it up. It's Jorge. There are no secretaries, and I don't know if you've ever dealt with the Catholic ecclesiastical world, but very often you have secretaries, undersecretaries, and everybody else before you actually get on the phone with the person you're trying to actually get to. Right? And with the Pope, it's even more remote, even more distant. Not in this case. The Pope does the phoning himself. And he phones Skorka, and he talks to him. So it's a relationship, an intellectual and spiritual relationship that continues. When Skorka preached about the Catholic Church and Nostra Aetate, the great document of 1985, he said, since the days of the approval of Nostra Aetate, there has developed more and more in many members of the Catholic Church the idea that the relation of Christianity and Judaism is special. Francis has devoted in his apostolic exhortation a special paragraph to the relations with the Jews and another one to interfaith dialogue and with other religions. He stresses the special and unique relation between the two religions, and the conclusion from that is the commitment we have to share in order to transmit the biblical message to all of humanity. This is the document he's referring to. Doesn't quote it, but this is it. It's called The Joy of the Gospel, Evangelii Gaudium. And let me just read you these two passages. They're just two small sections, but they're very condensed and they're very powerful. And what they do is they, in their own way, they provide a succinct and potent condensation, if you like, of all his thinking on Judaism and how this is going to define this pontificate. He says, "We hold the Jewish people in special regard because their covenant with God has never been revoked, for the gifts and the call of God are indeed irrevocable. The Church, which shares with Jews an important part of the sacred scriptures, looks upon the people of the covenant and their faith as one of the sacred roots of her own Christian identity. As Christians, we cannot consider Judaism as a foreign religion, nor do we include the Jews among those called to turn from the idols and to serve the one God. With them we believe in the one God who acts in history, and with them we accept God's revealed word. Dialogue and friendship with the children of Israel are part of the life of Jesus' disciples." That's the line. The praxis is the relationship with Skorka. Dialogue and friendship with the children of Israel. The friendship which has grown between us makes us bitterly and sincerely regret the terrible persecutions which they have endured and continue to endure, especially those that have involved Christians. God continues to work among the people of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Covenant, and to bring forth treasures of wisdom which flow from their encounter with his word. For this reason, the Church also is enriched when she receives the values of Judaism itself. While it is true that certain Christian beliefs are unacceptable to Judaism, and that the Church cannot refrain from proclaiming Jesus as Lord and Messiah, there exists as well a rich complementarity which allows us to read the texts of the Hebrew Scriptures together and to help one another to mine the riches of God's Word. We can also share many ethical convictions and a common concern for justice and the development of peoples. He doesn't spend any other time with any other group to the degree that he does with the Jewish community in this exhortation. Some have called it his mission statement. It's a one bulky mission statement. But if you want to have a sense of what Pope Francis intends to do and who he is, rather than go to the biographers, though it can be very revealing to read them, just go to this encyclical, or apostolic exhortation. He tells it the way it is. The way it is with the Jews is the way it is with his friend. That way came out of the crucible of the burning of several people, the massacre in 1994 in Buenos Aires. It seared itself onto his consciousness. In the same way as he fought the colonels and the generals and the work that they did, and indeed ended up fighting even with some of his own progressive Jesuits, which he came to, in some degree, to lament. Francis has demonstrated from the outset that his strong conviction is never just simply a matter of creed, never just simply or even primarily a matter of formulary or statute. What it is grounded in that interpersonal, that phenomenological, that gospel-specific, that tactility that you find in his relationship with everyone, whether it's a Monsignor he's never seen before or an old rabbi friend who's weathered many a battle with him in Buenos Aires and has joined him now, on occasion, in Rome as they look at new horizons in Catholic-Jewish relations. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, so if there's any questions from the audience.
In the lay press, the Pope appeared to have moved to welcome homosexuals into the church more than the church itself seemed to be ready for. Can you comment on whether that's an accurate impression that the press gave and what lay behind it?
I think that I know what you're referring to. It was a scrum on a plane. He was returning from Brazil, and he was asked about homosexuality, and he used a particular instance in which he talked about a priest and struggle, and simply concluded by saying, "Who am I to judge?" That is the phrase that was picked up by the press. It doesn't result in a kind of ethical endorsement of homoerotic behavior. What it does say, and this is classic Bergoglio, I'm not interested in the actions, I'm interested in the person. And so what on this, as on a number of other issues, Francis always chooses the route of mercy and non-judgment. He doesn't judge. He doesn't judge. And this is again, an experience that's very foreign to Catholics. Our popes tend to judge. We tend to want them to judge because we like that kind of clarity, right? We don't necessarily like what they judge, but we expect that they'll judge. To have a pope who is reluctant to judge and who chooses always to choose the pastoral mode as the way of entry into that person's life doesn't mean that he diminishes the doctrinal or the canonical or anything else. It's just he doesn't give it priority. For Francis, what really matters in the end is the Beatitudes. And so for him, it's the experience of mercy matters more than the conditions for receiving mercy. And the issue around homosexuality is a vexatious one, as I'm sure you know. And it will certainly arise again at the ordinary synod that will be held in Rome this October, because there was great debate and they didn't achieve the 2/3 signatories necessary in order for the synod document to be ratified, with passages in it that seemed particularly open and generous to same-sex relations, though not approving same-sex marriage, but understanding, or more pastoral. The fact that it wasn't passed seemed for some Catholics to indicate that the Pope had gambled and lost. That's a massive misreading of what he was doing. It's also to misunderstand what some of the bishop delegates were doing. Some of the bishop delegates voted against it because it wasn't strong enough. So it wasn't just simply an amassing of a particular group saying that this won't pass, a strong minority. It was a significant majority, actually, just not the required canonical majority. This doesn't mean a change in doctrine. I hasten to mention. This is a change in how pastorally we relate to people, how we give priority to mercy and to openness and to non-judgment. That sets the context in the larger sphere for a more generous opening for the pursuit of questions that have hitherto been so delicate that no one's been able either to open them, or if they have, it's been underground.
Just to continue with the point, he did say, "Who am I to judge?" But then he also said homosexuality is still a sin. And I read an apostolic letter by John Paul, who in some sense said about the same thing in 1986, that while homosexuals aren't evil, it is an inclination to do evil. And isn't this really the same, a continuation of the same kind of...
Don't think the Pope actually uses disordered or evil whenever he talks about homosexuals. Francis.
No, not Francis, John Paul.
Oh, yes. Well, John Paul and Ratzinger most definitely used it. He doesn't use the same language. You're quite correct. He doesn't come out and say that he approves of it, and I suspect that he won't. But the whole approach is different. It's more experiential. It's more pastoral. It's more existential. It's less It's less ontological. I think that, and this partly comes out of Francis' own training, because the question you raise is a good one. You've got to consider that Pope John Paul II was by training a philosopher, and he tended to think in philosophical terms and concepts. Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, was a very fine theologian, and he thought as a theologian. Francis thinks as a pastor. It doesn't mean he thinks less. There is a tendency sometimes among some of his critics, reactionary critics, to be dismissive of Francis by saying, well, he doesn't have the intellectual fortitude or wherewithal or genius of Benedict. And it's to massively misread him. He's highly educated, formed in the Society of Jesus, educated among the Germans, not at all unfamiliar with currents of contemporary thought. He's just always given his priority to the pastoral. So that is the way he'll approach it. It doesn't mean that there'll be a shift or nuancing or shading of the doctrine. It means that's always going to be secondary. What's going to be primary is the person.
Maybe you can stand up.
At the beginning of your talk, Michael, you spoke about Europe, the context of Europe, and the anti-Semitism in Europe. Can you talk a little more about Francis and that difficulty that arose?
Francis was outraged what happened around the Charlie Hebdo, but also even more so around the massacre in the kosher market and the subsequent desecration of the cemeteries, particularly on the Alsace border. He has each one of these he's identified specifically. He's not unaware of any of them. Cumulatively, they send a message to him of the resurgence of an anti-Semitic spirit in Europe, which horrifies him. One of the reasons why, when he spoke in Strasbourg to the European Parliament, and when he addresses the joint session of Congress, John Boehner is having involved himself in the controversy with the Netanyahu invitation, then sent an invitation to the Pope, and the Pope's going to be addressing the joint sessions in the fall. If the American lawmakers think that they're going to receive a gentle pat on the head, they're wrong. Because he will do as he does in every case, and that is address the issues of inequity, of injustice. And those circumstances or condition of injustice become the ground or the fire that feeds a resurgent anti-Semitism. And, because we didn't address the issue of post-colonial Algerian angst, or we've moved several of Frenchmen who are from the colonies living in the desperation of the banlieue rather than living in the cities proper, isolated, living under the heavy hand, actually, of les cités, you only create even greater hostility to the Republic. And you create even greater conditions of resentment towards people that you identify as the other. And the Jew is often identified as the other. So from Francis's point of view, it isn't just simply saying, we have to deal with this issue of Islamic, Jewish, and Christian strain with all its political and radical ramifications. We have to deal actually with the seeds of unrest that actually generate this. And for Francis, the primary issue is human inequity. He comes from Latin America. The condition of the poor overwhelms him. He's made it abundantly clear that the church is a church of the poor. This is one of the reasons why he doesn't like wealthy bishops. You may remember there was a German bishop who seemed to have some profound suicidal instinct. A $30,000 tub and gold shower curtain and everything during the reign of this man. And Francis, of course, removed him. It's Ernst Tabalts van Erst or something. They just call him Bishop Bling. And he removed him. Now he's brought him to Rome and he's given him some very minor role as an under-secretary in the Council of Migrants and the Homeless. Okay, this is Francis' sense of humor, right? Okay, so you want to live like a king? Well, I'm going to tell you how you're going to live. Right? So Francis sends the message out pretty strongly, I think, that if you're going to be a church full of poor, you better be church of the poor. And your leaders have to demonstrate that. And poverty of spirit, but the poverty that ransacks or scars our landscape. And I live in the United States and have now for 6 years. And the income disparity is absolutely astonishing. You know, the difference between the 0.001% and the rest of us is unbelievable. And it's not just Piketty and others who have begun to say, well, the implications of the potential aftershocks, revolutionary aftershocks of this kind of almost czarist-like division is actually beginning to have an impact on Democrats, and even some Republicans are beginning to think, well, you know, maybe we have to start rethinking some of this. Francis will drive this point home, you can be sure, very aggressively when it's in Washington. So there is a tendency, because people like him, he smiles all the time, he's affable, he does unpredictable, he gets angry. You look at some of the speeches, listen to him, he's angry. And it's not the self-righteous anger of a leader who has not much tolerance for dissent. It is the righteous anger of a prophet who's become desperate in his pleading. That's why. That's why.
I think one
more question.
I want to thank you for your talk. I'm hearing a lot of stuff. Okay, so I went to Israel, Palestine, and saw the injustice there, and I really thought, this is a mess, and I really don't know what the way forward is. And listening to you, it sounds like there's a bit of hope for peace in the Middle East. Is that?
Yes, I do. I mean, the situation is always fraught, of course, in the larger geopolitical realities during an American election, during an Israeli election. The various things that go on, of course, have implications. But the role that Francis can play as a mediator has become increasingly clear. And perhaps the most striking example is the public credit that President Obama gave to the recent rapprochement with Cuba. He identified Pope Francis as absolutely instrumental in that. And I don't think it's just because it's a Latin country. I think that more and more leaders will ask Francis to intervene because what he's developing is the authority, the moral authority of a voice people can listen to, partly because they know they won't be judged. It took quite a stroke of imagination to invite the president of Israel and the president of the Palestine Authority to come to Rome. Nobody else had done that. Now, was it successful? Not entirely. But was it more than a gesture? You bet. And so the cumulative build-up of these things, it seems to me, is an indicator that Francis sees, and as I told you, Francis's first deliberate trip was to Israel. Francis sees in reconciliation and peace the beginnings of the kingdom. He is a Christian priest, after all. But what he also understands is that this requires work. And here I'll end on this point. He also understands you've got to have your people doing this. Okay? The particular genius of Pope Francis, we're beginning to realize almost on a daily basis, is the consummate skill with which he's appointing senior metropolitans in dioceses all over the world to do his work. Nuncios who are actually listening to him. I'll give you an example. The Cardinal Archbishop of New York, Dolan, we call him Bubbles Dolan because he's a bit lightheaded. And he's very effervescent, and he's very friendly and everything, but he's not all that great. So anyway, Cardinal Dolan, the Archdiocese of New York, used to be the premier archdiocese in the United States. And when New York speaks. Doug Letson and I were once in Rome talking to the Archbishop, and he opened the door and he said to us, New York is here. And then walked O'Connor. I mean, you just know you have that power. Not anymore. Francis has chosen to make Blaise Supich of Chicago and Sean O'Malley, a Capuchin in Boston. They're his American presence. He doesn't listen to Dolan. Dolan wanted three auxiliary bishops. So he goes to the nuncio, he submits his name. Pope doesn't take any of them. The Pope takes 3 pastors working in downtown inner city parishes in New York. One of them is 74. And he said to the nuncio, that's the Vatican ambassador, when he phoned him up to say the Pope wants you to be a bishop, he said, does the Pope know how old I am? And he says, yes, he does. And he knows what work you do. Well, the Cardinal had to ordain 3 auxiliaries he had no intention of ordaining. Okay, and they were pastoral men who wouldn't know the inside of a chancery, didn't spend time on a tribunal. They spent all their time working with drug addicts, immigrants, the unemployed in downtown New York. That's what he does. With his nuncios, with his senior appointments that he's making in the Vatican dicasteries, with the phenomenal growth and influence of Latin bishops, but also bishops from the peripheries, from the peripheral area, from the margins, the diminishment of the traditional centers of power and authority. Last 2 consistories, he's only appointed 1 North American, a cardinal, and that was the Cardinal Archbishop of Quebec City. Usually there are several North Americans. He appointed a bishop from Tonga in the Maldives, and Burma, Myanmar. They've never had cardinals. This is what he's doing, okay? And this is all strategic. It's all, he knows exactly what he's doing. That's why when Rabbi Skorka said, they don't know my Jorge. They don't, but they're coming to. Okay.